What's up, folks? Casual Dad here, just with another end-of-season update for Warhammer Combat Cards. I hope that everyone had or is having a really terrific holiday season, that you got time to celebrate with your family or chosen family and whatever traditions you had. And I'm going to take a quick second to talk about lessons learned from the end of the most recent ladder season. I really wanted to do this because this is our first full season where we've had those secondary traits added for those epic and legendary cards, and it completely turned the meta on its head. So just to kind of talk through the decks that I usually run. My go-to Warlords for the past year and change have been, let me go through them one by one. Absolute top of the heap has been Lilith. And this is a complete change of the deck. Usually I did a mix of melee and ranged, but in this case I swapped it out to be really all heavily on melee because my previous deck just was not working. And that's going to be a theme for all of these, but there's Lilith as number one, and then who's my number two? Number two is going to be Graveaxe. And just like I did with Lilith, hang on, we'll get rid of that. Usually my Graveaxe deck has been pure Psychic, where it's just all of the top Psychers, all of the cheaper Psychers, and both area effect Psychers, and it's a really, really powerful deck. It's one that's done me really well for a lot of seasons, and I've been top 6%, I think, 4 seasons this past year, just because those are the ones I really ground for and really work to get that high up. But this time it just didn't work. I got kind of hard-walled. Even this deck, which is a much more aggressive, competitive version, even if it's somewhat lower level, this guy right here in particular, he's a really strong piece in a high-level Graveaxe deck, and mine is only level 7, so he's definitely got a ways to grow on that. This did me okay. She was one of the ones that stood out and performed about on par with what she usually does. I believe she topped out around 3.3k trophies, where I usually try to get 3.5 for all 4 of my top decks to get that top 6%. So didn't quite get there, but she's usually my second or third, so that was about on par. In previous seasons, Lilith has usually gotten me 3.7, and this time I struggled to get up to 3.2. And that's just kind of roughly, I was around 12k total trophies in my top 4 factions this season, and usually need to be over 13,000, or 13k to end up in that top 6%, and even then it's a little bit iffy. You want to be 13.2 or so. So it fell short this time. In this season I ended up around pretty much spot on. I was smack in the middle of the top 10%. I'm blanking on the exact trophy count right now. I think I may have just barely stuck it at exactly 13k. I think I hit that, which wasn't quite enough, but was enough to get me that top 10%, but I didn't get the free card. So those are my top two decks were Lilith and Graveaxe in previous seasons. And then my other two, this has changed a little bit, but it's usually been Mozrog, the Orc Warlord, every time really. And this deck is basically unchanged. This is more or less what I've used in previous seasons, and it works really, really well, leaning on those heavy and rage cards to really build up some power throughout the game as you're using Mozrog's ability to heal aggressively. And that's been usually very, very powerful, but has rocketed around my 4th of my top 4 decks, but has usually been my best work. The other one I've had in that space, around your 3rd or 4th rank, has been Skulltaker. And I don't think I've tweaked him. I didn't even try him this season because I didn't take the time to really level up Chaos, but that's more or less what I run there. I like to sprinkle in a little bit more poison than fear, but I'm kind of playing around with some new versions there. My 4th deck this season, or 4th deck in previous seasons that has been one of my absolute most powerful is my Tervigon. And the Tervigon is insanely powerful. I've talked about this before because of that free card. You can see I tried to get more experimental here. Usually my Tervigon is really heavy on ranged attacks and has your drop pod, your shielded cannon bug, the things that really, really do well, just tanking damage and not dying over the course of a game, and then that free card to spice in the extra damage and to help take out those Akaran decks, because that free card has the shot on drop. That'll help you take out those remaining 5 health cards. So like I said though, all 4 of those just completely fell flat for me. I was really having trouble getting past 11k this season. I did briefly get into the top 6% just by really messing with the timing. So I hit it really, really hard at the beginning of week 3, which is the absolute best time to ladder, because you get the best combination of progression, but actually points per win, and you lose the least points per loss. 1 second here. Anyway, but what I found here that made the biggest difference, so all 4 of those decks fell completely flat, just to kind of recap that. And so I ended up completely having to rework it, but with the latter seasons, you have to put in so much time getting your 4 main factions to the top that even getting maybe 5 to the top is a huge, huge time investment. So I really prefer to stick with my 4 and not change it up. So when that stopped working and I was experimenting, I did get a little bit more progression, and this season, my top 4 Warlords were actually... Gonna go back through the list here. Oh, he's near the bottom, of course, this guy. The Avatar. So Lilith was not carrying through. The problem was she didn't have enough staying power. In just about every single game at the top upper tier, or more than half of them, Lilith herself landed on the board and was just taken out by a beefy or particularly powerful bodyguard or warlord itself. And so the Avatar has the punch to finish those endgame fights where I wasn't able to make it through with the others. Likewise, with pretty much all of them, the issue I was having is that I didn't have enough hit points on my Warlord. Like, my deck was dying too quickly to decks that could easily take it down, and then even in the close ones, I ended up with a fairly weak Warlord against a very scary one. And that's kind of why Greyfax kept working, as she's still an incredibly scary bruiser at the end herself, but the other ones did not. So Greyfax stayed in, then I subbed in the Avatar, and then for Orcs, it was a bit of a surprise. Gaz. Old Gazgul Thraka himself was one of the ones that really stood out. So this is one I played... Ooh, nice, I got a level there. He's one that I played around with quite a bit at the end of the season, and outperformed my other Orc Warlords by a good bit, which was very, very surprising for me. I've always really liked him and the decks he can make, but they're just not all that potent, or haven't been in the past, just because, again, he himself hits really hard, but it's another case where you tend to want to play him, and when he gets on the board, he can very quickly melt. But it actually... he did very well this season. So that was my top 3, and then my 4th was actually the Swarmlord. So you'll notice the trend there. All of them are bruisers who have a good end game, who can actually fight. This one was a little bit satisfying because that's actually my classic deck that I've used for a long time with the Swarmlord, is just all Psychers and then a filler. It does very, very well softening things up and then charging up your melee attacks, doing a lot of damage, especially as these cards get leveled. And then he himself, of course, is a complete mauler on the battlefield. And now the single biggest surprise I wanted to go ahead and throw out for the season is that those secondary traits completely flipped to the meta. And if you were paying attention here, you would see that every single Warlord I ended up doing best with is legendary. So all of them have that early unlocked secondary trait. They also have the stats to be brawlers to really fight in the end game, because the other decks I was up against really leaned on those secondary traits. Usually not even the whole deck, maybe 1 or 2 cards plus the Warlord itself were the ones that really benefited, but it made such a huge impact in the game. And so that was my total rework. The decks that worked best for me were, again, in order. Number 1 was the Avatar. My Eldar still performed at the top. And then next was Greyfax herself, and then Gazgul, and then the Swarmlord kind of at the bottom part. But Gaz and the Swarmlord both could do that part pretty well. So yeah, that was the craziest thing. I was absolutely shocked to find that. But yeah, so my decks changed quite a bit, but then also the decks I ended up facing the most changed dramatically as well. And so this was kind of the biggest surprise for me, was the decks I was facing at the top were completely different. And those secondary traits really, really shone through. So Akaran may have been the first biggest surprise, is in previous seasons, you've seen a lot of Akaran at the top, and pretty much the same decks. I mentioned that, where it leans on Njal and, Njal, however you say that, and Tigurius himself, those 2 heavy Psychers, backed by some fear and regen and shields. I still saw that, but it was very rare, and I saw a lot more pure melee Akaran at that top percent that actually performed really well. So 3.5, 3.3k decks that were all melee that didn't even have Tigurius, but usually had Njal in there still. But the top Warlords that I struggled the most to get past, who I saw the most often and really beat me up, were... Akaran was still there. Didn't have that much trouble because I had counters for him, but I did... it was maybe a 30% chance that Akaran would beat me, even in my top decks. The other one that was a complete standout shock was the man himself, Santa. Now, Logan Grimnar benefited from that double trait. He now has that What's funny about this is I definitely underrated his secondary trait. So he got Enrage, Berserk. So he's always had Furious Charge and he got Berserk, but then these decks also leaned heavily on cards that had secondary traits. And this guy just made such a mess of me so many times over. There was no deck I had that could reliably stand up to the sheer volume of punch they would put out. And I think that the volume of Logan players really made a dent in how many Akaran players made it to the top. Because that spray damage can get through shields, it can take out wounded cards, and really just kind of plays hell with any deck that relies on durability to stay up. And these are smaller, lower card count decks that just hit incredibly hard very, very quickly. And then Logan himself is one of those really high hit point warlords that I just couldn't chew through in time before he killed me, before he or a bodyguard killed me. So that was a surprise how often I ran into him, where you barely saw him in previous seasons. He really stood out as one of the most improved ones. But then a couple others that really hit me. One that was definitely still diminished, but not at the same degree as Akaran, was Badruk. So I didn't see as many Badruks, but when I did see them, they were extremely difficult to beat. And that was a bit of a shock because the decks I saw had very few secondary traits in them. So we talked about this guy here. This guy got the additional secondary trait of that ready, and so did Badruk himself. So he's got both that barrage where he shoots on, or not barrage, but he shoots when he's deployed, and then also has that ready. In most of the games I've played against Badruk, if I'm on a winning streak where I can consistently beat Badruk decks, it's still kind of by the skin of my teeth, so they're very close. And it turns out that that ready value, that scout, really helps put him over the edge in the end game. Where in the past I'd have one or two bodyguards surviving for an extra turn on a handful of hit points. That extra boost was just enough to knock them over the edge and get the extra kills, and then leave me in a position where I didn't have enough oomph to finish off Badruk. And that was where I ended up with more of those brawlery, kind of heavier, punchier warlords that would then be able to finish that fight with him. So that was not all that surprising to see Badruk at the top. Still surprising to see him still at the top, where I didn't see as many others pop up. Canoness I did also see, but then the two biggest standouts that were surprising faction-wide, I saw a lot, especially in that final week. I saw a whole lot of Tau players. The biggest one was Darkstrider. Of course, this guy himself. But then also I saw quite a few Shadow Sun and Farsight players as well. And the biggest reason being, these big, heavy flyer cards all got secondary traits. So that Outflank, the Inspire on Long Strike, those really hard, heavy-hitting cards hit just a little bit harder than they ever did before with the combination of that Inspire and Debuff. And so it was really hard to weather the damage that they would dish out long enough to take out the Warlord. Even if it was Darkstrider himself, who's not very hard to take down, those flyers were doing so much damage that it just felt like a lot more than I'm used to seeing. And also I just saw a whole lot more of them. Just that was the biggest volume increase I saw in the entire thing, was the number of Tau players that made it that high up. And we're talking over 3.8, or sorry, over 3.3 to 3.6k. It was very common to see some Tau players getting that high up, which was a surprise, because they don't usually get that high. The other faction that appeared a lot, and this is a little bit of a surprise too, was Necrons. And the most common Necron I saw was the man himself, Nemesis Zandrek, who, if you don't know, when he's the first time he is about to take damage, his card disappears and is replaced with the Vargard Oberon, which is a taunt card that can help save some bodyguards for a little while and protects him from damage. The additional secondary trait that the Vargard got is that he now gets shields. So the combination of taunt and shields made it that much harder to remove him and do actual significant damage in the turns that he was deployed. But then also the Satan shards, all of these guys getting those secondary traits, these guys just surge to the top of the meta again. This guy in particular, of course, is very popular. I see him a lot. But getting the additional regen, and then on top of his just crazy attack stats already, he really, really stood out as very scary. I saw a handful of Seamet popping in with that shield, which is a new addition, but he wasn't as impactful as those Satan. Those things just hit so very hard. And then I saw a sprinkling of this guy in here too, because the addition of that regen really gives him a lot of staying power. So yeah, Necrons and Tau really made a dent this season that was a bit of a surprise. The other kind of standout who I'm used to seeing at the top, who still showed it up very strongly, was, of course... Oh, where are you, buddy. Artemis. Now, one thing we've seen a lot is that most of the decks I'm talking about are low card count, extremely powerful and hard hitting, but they use very expensive cards with high hit points, where Artemis's ability plays in perfectly. But one of the most impactful changes to Artemis, that's always been true, that's always been a powerful piece of his kit, and makes him very scary in general. But I talked about melee Marines being dramatically improved in my last couple of videos. So the hard-hitting melee cards in Marines got a big buff, which helps with Artemis. But then also his secondary trait of that target acquired that works on Warlords. One of the ways I'd usually beat Artemis is by kind of weathering his stuff and making sure to pull them in himself. And then, I mean, this guy's only level 8, but I saw quite a few Artemises that were 9 or 10, so they had the extra hit points and had that target acquired. Because, like I was saying, the way to beat Artemis was to pull him and then take him out without worrying about his last couple bodyguards, because they're usually fairly beefy and can be hard to take out, especially because of the constant pressure that his ability puts on your deck. But that is so much more difficult now with the target acquired, because you can't work on him for a turn or two, because when he returns fire on you, hit all of his bodyguards as full board will be shooting at your Warlord. So your Warlord's taking that much more pressure, that much more quickly, and it really was a significant difference in how challenging he was to beat, especially for some of those beefier decks like your Logans or some of the other kind of Warlords that were a little bit more fighty. So you saw his counters kind of back up a little bit, not appear in the meta, and some of the things he countered best appear more, so I did see Artemis performing very, very well. In terms of Artemis, and this was also true of Logan, in addition to Warlords, there were a handful of cards that if I saw them I expected just to lose. And the number one that came up the most often is Mephiston. This guy's always had somewhat of a presence in the game, he's always showed up, he's got great stats, hits really, really hard, especially in melee, has a lot of hit points, but he's also quite expensive. And his trait of Death Blow is always really powerful, but it's one of those things where you don't put this in your deck to have him die. But the addition of Fear, and I saw a surprising number of cards that were high enough level to have that second or third level Fear, makes him just so much harder to remove, and this is not a card you want to duke it out with. He's doing so much damage in Psychic and Melee that it just does tremendous damage to your deck, and it just takes so long to remove him. That addition of Fear made this guy hugely impactful, and I talked about heavy melee decks. Both the Artemis decks I saw and those Logan decks tended to have him in there, especially the ones that would beat me up the most. So if I saw him drop, I expected to lose that game, which was... it was surprising to see a single card have that much impact, but he certainly did. I did also see quite a few drops of Shrike, just because he gained the new target acquired. He's also always had a decent balance of stats to cost, with a really good melee attack and a good ranged attack. That target acquired is something Space Marines have always wanted, but it's always... There's of course the ranged target acquired that you want to do in any Tolmaron deck, but then in any other Marine deck there wasn't a good spot to put it in there, just because the melee target acquired card isn't that great. He only does melee attack, he costs 11 points, and then his hit points aren't great. His melee damage is good, but it's nothing to write home about. So having this card that's already something you want in your deck already, then come with target acquired, just really amped up his utility, and I saw him a lot more than I ever did before. So yeah, melee Marines showed through, but not the ones I expected. And then a lot of the Warlords I might more traditionally see, I didn't see as much. Couple honorable mentions. I did see quite a few Canoness decks doing very well at the top. I saw quite a few Rakarth decks, those healing Eldar decks doing very well at the top. I beat them more consistently than the other decks I've talked about, but did see them up there with those high ranks where they were definitely holding their own. And I also saw, you don't see very many, but when you see a Glogothrox deck in that top 10% or above, it's usually rocking like 3.6k and is not usually all that hard to beat, quote unquote, not usually all that hard, but you can see when you play it how if it was played by a human player who's using that ability and feeding some of the more expendable cards to your really hard hitters, you could see how that would be a very strong counter to some of the rough decks out there, especially again those ones being very aggressive and low card count, so you could just feed them endless cards for a while until they did no damage and then ignore them for the rest of the game. Extremely powerful ability, and saw a lot of decks do really well with him. I believe that's it. I did also see some Snickrot, saw a little bit of Ahriman, but not much. I think he's probably one of the more underrated ones because he's still incredibly powerful. A lot of cards benefited from that secondary trait, so I do expect to see him perform much better. But I was pretty shocked at how significantly different the meta was, and I really enjoyed playing this season. It was a good time. And just to kind of talk it up a bit, for this next season, I still have... Some of my factions are just higher power than the others, so I'm still going to rock Eldar. I'm going to go ahead and do Servants of the Emperor, and then I'm also going to do Tyranids, just because they're still my favorite. But for my fourth faction, it's looking like it's going to be Chaos this time, and right now I'm ramping it up with Ahriman, just with a very Tzeentch-heavy deck. Tzeentch, whatever. Again, one that benefited really dramatically from secondary traits. That regen on the Lord of Change is surprisingly impactful, and that Scion or Warp Surge on Ahriman himself is just super powerful. He drops for I think 90 damage if you have a board full of Psychers at this level, and then hits for something like 140, not counting the area effect blasts from either of these guys on the board. Any boosts you may have hits incredibly hard. So he has enough hit points to not be taken down immediately, but he's really kind of an alpha warlord where you drop him, expect him to do enough damage to take out that straggling bodyguard or really weaken an enemy warlord so you can finish him off. We'll see how that goes. I did see Chaos perform quite well in the top 10%, so I have some other options. Huron appeared quite a bit at higher levels. I did see Skulltaker occasionally, and he's performed well for me in the past. And being a melee-focused deck, I expect him to hold his own against the kind of melee-dominant meta we're seeing right now. But yeah, so we'll see how that goes. If you're kind of struggling with what to play and haven't tried anything for a while, I would take another look at those Necron and Tau decks for sure, but then also focus on upgrading your melee Marines, and then of course whatever you like playing the most. But definitely keep an eye on those cards that have gained those secondary traits. It was easy to talk through them in a vacuum, kind of talk through, look at the card, but seeing them in play, it's dramatically different. So it's pretty cool. So I probably won't do as many updates as I did this season, but I'll do a couple check-ins throughout this particular season as we get into the new year. So yeah, again, I hope you had great holidays, and see you next time.